Martha Henderson had lived alone in her small wooden house on the edge of Canyon Creek for nearly 20 years. At 78 years old, she had grown accustomed to the quiet life that retirement brought her. Her husband had passed away a decade earlier, and her children lived in distant cities, visiting only during holidays. The house, once filled with laughter and the sounds of family gatherings, now echoed with the gentle creaking of old wood and the whisper of desert winds. Every morning, Martha would sit on her front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the red rock formations that surrounded her small town. She had moved here from Chicago after her husband's death, seeking peace and solitude in the vast landscapes of the Southwest. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile away, and the closest town was a 30-minute drive through winding desert roads. On this particular Tuesday morning in late autumn, Martha noticed something unusual. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the air carried the scent of approaching rain. In this part of Arizona, rain was always welcome but often unpredictable. She had learned to read the signs of the desert, and today felt different somehow. As she prepared her simple breakfast of toast and jam, Martha heard voices in the distance. This was odd because very few people passed by her remote property. Curious, she stepped outside and shielded her eyes against the morning sun. Walking along the dirt road that passed by her house was a group of men, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. As they drew closer, Martha could see they were Native American men, likely Navajo based on their traditional clothing and the direction they were traveling. There were 15 of them, walking in a loose group, carrying what appeared to be bundles and water containers. Their faces showed exhaustion, and their slow, deliberate pace suggested they had been walking for a long time. Martha had always respected the Native American communities in the area. She had learned about their history and traditions during her years living in the Southwest, and she understood the deep connection they had to this land. Her heart went out to these travelers who appeared tired and possibly lost. Without hesitation, she walked down her gravel driveway toward the road. The men noticed her approach and slowed their pace. The eldest among them, a man with graying hair and weathered features, stepped forward slightly. His eyes were kind but cautious, as if he was unsure of her intentions. "Good morning," Martha called out in a friendly voice. "Are you gentlemen all right? You look like you've been walking for quite some time." The elder man nodded respectfully. "Good morning, ma'am. We are traveling to join our families for a ceremony. Our truck broke down about 20 miles back, and we decided to walk rather than wait for help that might not come." Martha's expression filled with concern. 20 miles was a considerable distance to walk in the desert, especially with the unpredictable weather approaching. She looked at the group more carefully and noticed signs of their long journey. Their water containers appeared nearly empty, and several of the younger men were breathing heavily. 20 miles in this heat," she said, shaking her head. "When did you last eat?" The men exchanged glances, and the elder spoke again. "We shared some dried meat yesterday evening. We wanted to save what little food we had for the journey ahead." Martha's grandmother instincts kicked in immediately. She had raised 4 children and knew hunger when she saw it. These men needed food and rest, and she had both to offer. Her small house might not be much, but it had a full kitchen and plenty of space for people to rest. "Well, that simply won't do," she said firmly. "I insist you all come up to my house. I'll prepare a proper meal, and you can rest before continuing your journey. The weather looks like it might turn, and you shouldn't be walking in a storm." The men looked surprised by her offer. In their experience, not all encounters with non-native people were friendly or welcoming. But something about this elderly woman's genuine concern and warm demeanor put them at ease. The elder man consulted quietly with the others in their native language. After a brief discussion, he turned back to Martha. "That is very kind of you, ma'am, but we don't want to impose. We can continue on our way." "Nonsense," Martha replied with the authority that only grandmothers possess. "I'm Martha Henderson, and I've been living here long enough to know that the desert can be unforgiving. I have plenty of food, and it would be my pleasure to share it with you. Besides, I don't get many visitors, and I'd enjoy the company." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. The elder man smiled for the first time since she had approached them. "I am Thomas Begay, and these are my relatives and friends. If you are certain it would not be a burden, we would be grateful for your kindness." "No burden at all," Martha assured him. "Follow me up to the house. I'll get started on a meal right away." As the group made their way up the gravel driveway, Martha's mind was already working through what she could prepare. She had groceries for the week, including ground beef, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. It would be simple food, but there would be enough for everyone. The men sat on her porch and in the shade of her large cottonwood tree while Martha bustled around her kitchen. She prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee. The aroma filled the house and drifted outside, where the men waited patiently. As she cooked, Martha learned more about her guests. They were traveling to a traditional ceremony that would last several days, bringing together families from across the region. It was an important spiritual gathering that happened only once a year, and missing it would be deeply disappointing to their relatives who were expecting them. When the meal was ready, Martha served it on her best dishes, treating her unexpected guests with the same respect she would show any honored visitor. The men ate gratefully, praising her cooking and sharing stories of their families and traditions. The afternoon passed pleasantly, filled with conversation and laughter. As evening approached, the promised storm arrived with dramatic lightning and heavy rain. Martha insisted the men stay until it passed, offering them blankets and shelter. They spent the night on her porch and in her living room, grateful for her continued hospitality. The next morning dawned clear and bright. After sharing breakfast together, the men prepared to continue their journey, now refreshed and well-fed. Thomas Begay approached Martha with deep gratitude in his eyes, speaking words in Navajo that she didn't understand but whose meaning was clear from his tone. "We will not forget your kindness," he said in English. "You have shown us great generosity and we hope to repay it someday." Martha waved off his thanks, insisting she had simply done what anyone would do. As she watched the 15 men disappear down the dusty road, she felt a warm satisfaction in her heart, unaware that this simple act of kindness would soon bring an extraordinary response. Martha returned to her quiet routine the day after the Navajo men continued their journey. She cleaned her dishes, washed the extra blankets she had provided, and swept the porch where her guests had rested. The house felt emptier than usual after the warmth and conversation of the previous day, but she carried a pleasant feeling of having done something meaningful. As she went about her morning chores, Martha found herself thinking about Thomas Begay and his companions. She wondered if they had reached their destination safely, and whether their ceremony was proceeding as planned. The desert could be challenging even for those who knew it well, and she hoped they had encountered no further difficulties on their journey. The weather had cleared completely after the storm, leaving the air crisp and clean. Martha decided to spend the morning tending to her small garden, where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Gardening had become one of her favorite activities since moving to Arizona, and she enjoyed the peaceful solitude it provided. Around midday, while she was watering her plants, Martha heard an unusual sound in the distance. It was rhythmic and low, like drums beating in a steady pattern. She paused, listening carefully, but the sound faded away. Living so close to several Native American communities, she occasionally heard music or ceremonies carried on the desert wind, though usually not this clearly. That evening, as Martha prepared her simple dinner, she noticed lights flickering on the horizon. They appeared to be campfires or lanterns, scattered across the landscape in what seemed like an organized pattern. This was unusual because the area where she saw the lights was largely uninhabited desert, with no towns or settlements she knew of. Curious but not alarmed, Martha stood on her porch with a pair of binoculars her late husband had used for birdwatching. Through the lenses, she could make out what appeared to be a large gathering of people in the distance. The lights were indeed from campfires, and there seemed to be many tents or temporary structures arranged in a wide circle. "Must be that ceremony Thomas mentioned," she said to herself, smiling at the thought that the men had reached their destination successfully. She was pleased to know they were safe and celebrating with their families as planned. The next morning brought another beautiful desert sunrise, and Martha settled into her usual routine of coffee on the porch. As she sat enjoying the peaceful morning, she noticed movement on the horizon. At first it appeared to be a dust cloud, the kind that might be raised by wind or distant traffic. But as she watched, the movement became more defined and purposeful. Through her binoculars, Martha could see what looked like a large group of people approaching her property. They were still quite far away, but they appeared to be walking in an organized formation. Her first thought was that it might be hikers or perhaps a group participating in some kind of desert expedition. As the morning progressed, The group drew steadily closer. Martha began to feel a mixture of curiosity and slight concern. Living alone in such a remote location, she was naturally cautious about unexpected visitors, especially such a large group. She considered calling her neighbor Jim Watson, who lived down the road, but decided to wait and see what developed. By late morning, the approaching group was close enough for Martha to see them more clearly without binoculars. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the magnitude of what she was witnessing. This was not a small group of hikers or tourists. Hundreds of people were walking across the desert toward her property, and as they came closer, she could see they were Native American men, women, and children. The group moved with purpose and dignity, their colorful clothing and traditional accessories visible even from a distance. Some rode horses while others walked, but all seemed to be moving in harmony toward her small house. Martha had never seen anything like it in her 20 years of desert living. As they drew nearer, Martha could hear the sound of drums and what might have been chanting or singing. The music was beautiful and haunting, carried on the desert air like an ancient melody that seemed to belong to the landscape itself. She found herself deeply moved by the sound, though she didn't understand its meaning. The lead members of the procession reached the edge of her property around noon. Martha stood on her porch, uncertain whether to approach or wait for them to make the first move. She felt no fear, only amazement at the incredible sight before her. The group was even larger than she had initially thought, with people of all ages dressed in both traditional and modern clothing. At the front of the procession, Martha recognized Thomas B. Gay, the elder who had spoken for the group of 15 men she had helped 2 days earlier. He was riding a beautiful painted horse and wearing what appeared to be ceremonial clothing. When he saw her standing on the porch, he raised his hand in greeting and dismounted. Behind Thomas, the enormous group came to a stop, creating a scene that seemed to stretch across the entire visible landscape. Martha estimated there must be several hundred people, possibly more. Children played quietly near their parents, horses stamped and nickered softly, and the gentle sound of conversation in various native languages created a peaceful background murmur. Thomas approached the porch with the same respectful manner he had shown during his previous visit. He was accompanied by several other elders, both men and women, who carried themselves with obvious dignity and authority. Martha could tell immediately that this was not a casual gathering, but something deeply significant. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said with a warm smile. "I hope we have not alarmed you with our arrival. We have come to honor the kindness you showed to me and my companions." Martha was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture. "Thomas, I don't understand. What is all this? There are so many people." "When we reached our ceremony and told our families and friends about your generosity, word spread quickly through our communities," Thomas explained. "Your kindness to 15 hungry strangers touched many hearts. Our people believe that such acts of generosity should be recognized and honored." One of the female elders stepped forward, a woman with silver hair braided with colorful ribbons and wearing a traditional dress decorated with intricate beadwork. "I am Sarah Yazzie," she said in accented but clear English. "I speak for many of the women who have come today. In our tradition, when someone feeds the hungry without expecting anything in return, especially when that someone is not of our people, it is a sacred act that must be acknowledged." Martha felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had simply done what felt right, what her own grandmother had taught her about treating others with kindness. The idea that this simple act had inspired such an extraordinary response was almost too much to comprehend. "I just made some stew and coffee," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "It was nothing special. Anyone would have done the same thing." "But not everyone would have," replied another elder, an elderly man leaning on a carved wooden staff. "We have not always been welcomed by those who live on what was once our land. Your open heart and generous spirit reminded us that kindness still exists in the world." As Martha stood on her porch looking out at the incredible gathering, she began to understand that she was witnessing something truly remarkable. This was not just a thank you visit, but a ceremony of recognition that connected her simple act of kindness to traditions and values that stretched back generations. The afternoon sun beat down on the assembled crowd, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. Martha realized that whatever was happening here was just beginning, and she was about to become part of something far greater than she had ever imagined possible. As the afternoon progressed, Martha found herself at the center of an extraordinary cultural exchange that she never could have imagined. The hundreds of people who had traveled to honor her kindness began organizing themselves into what appeared to be a traditional ceremony. Women spread colorful blankets on the ground, creating comfortable seating areas, while men tended to horses and unloaded supplies from travois and pickup trucks that had followed the walking procession. Thomas Begay approached Martha's porch again, this time accompanied by a younger man who carried what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Mrs. Henderson, we would like to ask your permission to hold a blessing ceremony on your land. It is our way of honoring what you did for us and ensuring that your kindness is remembered properly." Martha felt overwhelmed by the request. Her small property had never hosted anything more elaborate than a barbecue for a few neighbors. Now hundreds of people wanted to hold a sacred ceremony in her yard. "Of course," she managed to say. "I would be honored. But please, I don't know anything about your customs. What should I do?" Sarah Yazzie, the elder woman who had introduced herself earlier, smiled warmly. "You need only be yourself, the same generous woman who opened her door to strangers. We will guide you through everything." The younger man with Thomas unwrapped his bundle to reveal the most beautiful blanket Martha had ever seen. It was woven in intricate patterns of red, black, white, and turquoise, with designs that seemed to tell a story in their geometric shapes and symbols. "This is a gift from our weavers," Thomas explained. "It was made specifically for you after we shared the story of your kindness." Martha accepted the blanket with trembling hands, running her fingers over the incredibly fine weaving. She could hardly believe that skilled artisans had created something so beautiful just for her. "It's absolutely magnificent," she whispered. "I've never received such a wonderful gift." As the sun began to lower in the western sky, the ceremony preparations intensified. A large circle was formed in Martha's front yard, with the participants arranging themselves according to what appeared to be traditional protocol. Martha was given a place of honor near the center, seated on a comfortable cushion with the precious blanket draped around her shoulders. The ceremony began with drumming and singing that seemed to connect the assembled people with the very essence of the desert landscape. Martha closed her eyes and let the haunting melodies wash over her, feeling a deep spiritual connection to something much larger than herself. Even though she didn't understand the words, the emotion and reverence in the voices moved her profoundly. Elder after elder stood to speak, sharing stories in both English and Navajo about the importance of hospitality and generosity in their culture. Martha learned that feeding strangers was considered one of the highest virtues in Navajo tradition, connected to ancient teachings about caring for all living beings. "Long ago," explained one elderly man, "our grandmothers taught us that when we feed another person, we are feeding the spirit of life itself." "Your grandmother's heart beat in your chest when you invited our relatives into your home." Another elder, a woman whose age was evident in her deeply lined face but whose voice remained strong and clear, told Martha about the traditional concept of Hoju, which meant living in balance and harmony with all things. "When you showed kindness to our men without expecting anything in return, you demonstrated Hoju perfectly. This is why so many have come to honor you." As the speakers continued, Martha began to understand that her simple act of making a meal had resonated through the interconnected communities of the region. Word had spread from family to family, from one reservation to another, carried by relatives and friends who were moved by the story of the elderly white woman who had treated Navajo strangers like honored guests. "We live in a time when there is much division between peoples," Thomas said during his turn to speak. "Your actions reminded us that kindness has no color, no boundaries. It exists wherever there are good hearts willing to share what they have." When it came time for Martha to respond, she felt nervous about speaking to such a large and culturally significant gathering. She stood slowly, still wrapped in the beautiful blanket, and looked out at the faces surrounding her. Men, women, and children of all ages looked back at her with expressions of warmth and respect. "I don't really know what to say," Martha began, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Where I come from, we were taught that when someone is hungry, you feed them. When someone needs shelter, you provide it if you can. It's just what decent people do for each other." She paused, looking around at the incredible scene surrounding her. "But I'm learning today that what seems simple to one person can mean something much deeper to others. I'm grateful that my small action brought you all together, and I'm honored to be part of whatever this is." Her words were met with approving murmurs and nods from the crowd. Several people called out words in Navajo that sounded like expressions of agreement and approval. As the formal speaking portion of the ceremony concluded, the gathering transformed into something more like a community celebration. Families began sharing food they had brought, creating an impromptu feast that spread across Martha's property. The variety and abundance of dishes amazed her. Traditional fry bread, mutton stew, corn dishes, and modern foods alongside ancient recipes. Martha found herself moving through the crowd, meeting people who had traveled from across Arizona and even neighboring states to be part of the ceremony. Each person had a story to share about why Martha's kindness had touched them personally. Many spoke of times when they or their families had faced similar situations, walking long distances or finding themselves in need of help from strangers. A group of teenage girls approached Martha shyly, speaking softly among themselves in Navajo before one found the courage to speak in English. "Mrs. Henderson, we want to thank you because our grandfather was one of the men you helped. He told us how scared he was that night, walking in the desert with the storm coming. You saved them." Children who had been playing quietly throughout the ceremony began gathering around Martha, curious about this grandmother who had become the center of such an important event. She found herself surrounded by little faces looking up at her with wonder and acceptance. Without thinking, she began telling them stories about her own grandchildren, and soon had them laughing at tales of mischief and adventure. As the evening stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha realized that this day had changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had discovered a community she never knew existed, formed connections that transcended cultural boundaries, and learned that kindness could create ripples far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The ceremony was far from over, and Martha sensed that even greater surprises awaited her as the night progressed. Looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight, she felt a deep sense of belonging to something ancient and sacred, something that had begun with a simple offer of food and had grown into a celebration of human connection that would be remembered for generations. As night fell across the desert, the celebration around Martha's home took on an even more magical quality. Dozens of small fires were lit in careful arrangement around her property, creating a constellation of warm light that seemed to mirror the stars appearing overhead. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the faces of the gathered people, creating an atmosphere that felt both ancient and timeless. Martha had never experienced anything like the sense of community that surrounded her now. Throughout her life, she had attended church gatherings, neighborhood barbecues, and family reunions, but nothing had prepared her for the profound spiritual energy that seemed to flow through this gathering. It was as if the very act of coming together to honor kindness had created something sacred. Sarah Yazzie approached Martha as she sat near one of the central fires, still wrapped in the magnificent blanket that had been gifted to her. The elder woman carried a small clay pot that contained what appeared to be burning herbs, sending fragrant smoke into the night air. "This is white sage and sweetgrass," Sarah explained, offering the pot to Martha. "We use these sacred plants to purify and bless. Would you like me to teach you about this tradition?" Martha nodded eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to learn more about the customs of her honored guests. Sarah showed her how to cup her hands and draw the smoke toward herself, explaining that this was a way of cleansing negative energy and inviting positive spirits. Our grandmothers believed that when we perform acts of kindness, we open doorways between the physical and spiritual worlds, Sarah said as Martha followed her instructions. "Tonight those doorways are wide open because of what you did." As the sage ceremony concluded, Thomas Begay stood and called for attention from the gathered crowd. The conversations gradually quieted as people turned toward him, their faces expectant in the firelight. "We have come here tonight not just to thank Mrs. Henderson for her kindness, but to make her part of our extended family," Thomas announced. "In our tradition, when someone shows such generosity to our people, we adopt them as relatives. From this night forward, Martha Henderson will be known among our people as grandmother who feeds the hungry." The crowd erupted in approval, with voices calling out in both English and Navajo. Martha felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. These people were offering her something far more precious than thanks. They were offering her belonging, identity, and purpose within their community. An elderly woman Martha hadn't met before approached the fire carrying what appeared to be a leather pouch decorated with beadwork. She spoke in Navajo to Thomas, who translated for Martha. "This is Ematsosi, one of our most respected medicine women. She says that in a dream last night she saw you surrounded by protective spirits. She wants to give you something that belonged to her own grandmother." Emma opened the pouch and withdrew a stunning necklace made of turquoise, silver, and coral. The craftsmanship was obviously ancient, with some stones showing the soft patina that comes only from being handled lovingly for many years. She gestured for Martha to bow her head, then placed the necklace around her neck. Speaking in heavily accented English, Emma said, "This was made by my grandmother's grandmother. It carries the protection of all the women in our family. Now it protects you too, because you are our grandmother now." Martha touched the necklace with reverent fingers, overwhelmed by the honor being bestowed upon her. She had expected perhaps a simple thank you, but instead found herself being formally adopted into a culture and community that stretched back centuries. The gift-giving continued throughout the evening. Families approached Martha with handmade items that clearly held deep personal significance. She received pottery created by master artisans, woven baskets that had taken months to complete, carved fetishes meant to bring protection and good fortune, and jewelry that represented generations of traditional craftsmanship. Each gift came with a story about why it was being given. A young mother presented Martha with a small clay jar, explaining that it had been made by her daughter who wanted to give something to the kind grandmother. An elderly man offered a walking stick he had carved himself, saying it would help Martha navigate the desert paths if she ever wanted to visit their communities. As the night progressed, Martha found herself participating in traditional dances around the central fire. The steps were simple enough for her to follow, and the other participants patiently guided her through the movements. She laughed with delight as children took her hands and spun her around, their joy infectious and pure. The music was unlike anything Martha had ever heard. Some songs were ancient, passed down through generations and carrying stories of creation, survival, and hope. Others were more contemporary, blending traditional melodies with modern themes but maintaining the spiritual essence that seemed to define Navajo music. During one particularly beautiful song, Martha noticed that many of the older participants had tears in their eyes. When she asked Sarah about this, the elder woman explained that the song was about finding family in unexpected places, about how kindness could bridge any divide between peoples. "Our ancestors knew that the earth belongs to all living things," Sarah said. "They taught us that when we find someone with a good heart, it doesn't matter what color their skin is or where they come from. A good heart is a good heart." As midnight approached, the formal ceremony began to wind down, but Martha sensed that her relationship with these people was just beginning. Throughout the evening, she had received multiple invitations to visit different communities, to attend other ceremonies, and to be part of celebrations throughout the year. Thomas Begay presented her with a beautifully carved wooden staff topped with feathers and small medicine bundles. "This is a talking stick," he explained. "It means you have the right to speak at any gathering of our people. Your voice will always be heard and respected among us." The symbolism was not lost on Martha. She understood that she was being given not just gifts, but also responsibilities. She was being trusted with sacred objects and traditions, invited to be a bridge between cultures, and expected to carry forward the message of kindness and understanding. As the crowd began to prepare for the night, with some families setting up tents and others preparing to sleep under the stars, Martha realized that this gathering would continue for several more days. She was not just witnessing a single ceremony, but the beginning of what appeared to be a significant cultural event that would have lasting impact on everyone involved. Standing in her front yard, surrounded by hundreds of people who had traveled great distances to honor a simple act of kindness, Martha felt a profound sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. Her quiet retirement had suddenly become something far more meaningful, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The desert night was filled with the gentle sounds of a community settling in for rest, but Martha knew that sleep would be difficult. She had too much to process, too many emotions to sort through, and too much excitement about what tomorrow might bring. Martha awakened before dawn to the gentle sounds of a community stirring to life around her property. Through her bedroom window, she could see the soft glow of rekindled fires and hear the quiet conversations of early risers preparing for the day. The sight filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years, as if she had awakened to find herself surrounded by a loving extended family. After dressing quickly, Martha stepped onto her porch to discover that someone had left a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of fresh fry bread on her small table. A handwritten note in careful English read, "Good morning, grandmother. Thank you for everything, Maria Yazzie." Martha smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness, and settled into her usual morning routine with the addition of her new community around her. As the sun rose over the red rock formations, painting the desert in brilliant shades of gold and orange, the full scope of the gathering became visible in the daylight. Martha counted at least 30 tents and temporary shelters scattered across her property and the adjacent public land. Pickup trucks, horse trailers, and RVs were parked in organized rows, creating what looked like a temporary village that had sprouted overnight. Thomas Begay approached her porch, carrying his own cup of coffee and wearing a comfortable smile. "Good morning, Grandmother Martha. Did you sleep well despite all the activity?" "Actually, I slept better than I have in months," Martha replied honestly. "There's something comforting about having so many people nearby. I haven't felt this safe and connected in a long time." "That is the power of community," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside her. "We believe that when people come together with good intentions, healing happens naturally. Not just for individuals, but for the land and all living things." As they talked, Martha learned more about the significance of what was happening on her property. Word of the gathering had spread far beyond the immediate Navajo communities, reaching other tribal nations and even non-native people who had been moved by the story of her kindness. Representatives from several other tribes had arrived during the night, bringing their own gifts and ceremonies to add to the celebration. "Your simple act of kindness has become something much larger," Thomas explained. "It's become a symbol of hope for better relationships between all peoples. In a time when there's so much division and distrust, your open door represents what's possible when we see each other as family." Throughout the morning, Martha met people who had traveled from incredible distances to be part of this gathering. A group of Hopi elders had driven 6 hours from their mesas in northeastern Arizona. A family of Tohono O'odham people had come from the southern desert near the Mexican border. Even a delegation of Lakota representatives had flown in from South Dakota, bringing traditional gifts and songs from the Great Plains. Each group brought their own customs and traditions to share, creating a rich tapestry of Native American culture that few people ever had the opportunity to witness. Martha found herself at the center of an unprecedented intertribal gathering, one that was happening specifically because of her willingness to share a meal with hungry strangers. A Hopi elder named Robert Naminga presented Martha with a small carved kachina doll, explaining its significance in their religious traditions. "This represents the spirit of generosity," he said. "We believe that when someone shows true kindness, they become a vessel for positive energy to flow into the world." The Tohono O'odham family brought traditional basket weaving materials and spent hours teaching Martha the ancient techniques their grandmothers had used. As her fingers learned to work with the desert grasses and willow shoots, Martha felt connected to generations of women who had created beautiful and functional art from the materials provided by the land. The Lakota delegation performed a special honor song for Martha, their powerful voices and drumming creating a spiritual experience that moved everyone present to tears. Their leader, a woman named Grace Crow Feather, explained that they had felt called to make the long journey because Martha's story reminded them of their own traditions of honoring those who feed the hungry. "In our language we have a saying, Mitakuye Oyasing, which means all my relations," Grace said. "It reminds us that we are connected to all living things, and when one person shows kindness, it touches the entire web of life." As the day progressed, Martha realized that she was witnessing something historically significant. Never before had so many different tribal nations come together specifically to honor a non-native person's act of kindness. The gathering was being documented by tribal historians and photographers, who recognized that this event would be remembered and talked about for generations. Local news outlets had somehow learned about the gathering, and several reporters arrived seeking interviews. However, the tribal leaders politely but firmly restricted media access, explaining that this was a sacred ceremony that should not be turned into a spectacle for public consumption. They wanted to protect the spiritual integrity of what was happening, while still allowing the positive message to spread. One of the most moving moments of the day came when a group of young people from various tribes performed a unity dance they had created specifically for the occasion. The dance combined movements and songs from different traditions, symbolizing how Martha's kindness had brought diverse communities together in harmony. Martha was invited to join the dance, and as she moved with the young people in the center of a large circle formed by hundreds of participants, she felt a profound spiritual connection that transcended all cultural boundaries. The rhythm of the drums seemed to beat in harmony with her own heartbeat, and the voices raised in song created a sound that felt both ancient and eternal. During the afternoon, a council of elders from all the represented tribes gathered to discuss something they described as a sacred responsibility. Martha was invited to sit with them as they talked about the significance of what had occurred and what it meant for the future. "What you did was not just kindness to 15 individuals," explained Joseph Crow Dog, one of the Lakota elders. "You showed respect for the sacred tradition of hospitality that exists in all our cultures. This gathering proves that such values still exist and can bring people together." The council presented Martha with an unprecedented honor, a written document, beautifully illustrated with traditional designs, declaring her an honorary grandmother to all the tribes represented at the gathering. The document was signed by spiritual leaders and chiefs from dozens of communities, making it one of the most significant intertribal recognitions ever bestowed upon a non-native person. "This is not just a certificate," Thomas Begay explained as he presented the document to Martha. "It carries real responsibilities and privileges. You are now considered family by thousands of people across many states. You have relatives you haven't even met yet, who will welcome you as bloodkin." As evening approached, preparations began for what the elders described as the most important ceremony of the gathering, the blessing of the sacred fire. This was an ancient ritual that was performed only on the most significant occasions, and Martha learned that it hadn't been done with this many tribes participating in over a century. The ceremony would formally recognize Martha as a bridge between cultures and would ask the spirits to bless her home as a place of peace and understanding for all peoples. Representatives from each tribe would contribute elements to a sacred fire that would burn throughout the night, carrying prayers and gratitude up to the heavens. As the sun set on what had been one of the most extraordinary days of Martha's life, she stood on her porch looking out at the incredible scene before her. Her simple act of feeding hungry strangers had created something beautiful and unprecedented, bringing together communities that rarely had the opportunity to celebrate their shared values. The preparation for the evening ceremony filled her with anticipation and a deep sense of responsibility. She understood now that her life had taken on a new purpose, one that connected her not just to the people gathered on her land, but to future generations who would hear this story and perhaps be inspired to show kindness to strangers in their own lives. The transformation from lonely widow to honored grandmother of multiple tribes was almost too much to comprehend. But as Martha watched families preparing for the sacred fire ceremony, she felt ready to embrace whatever responsibilities and blessings lay ahead. The sacred fire ceremony began at sunset, with representatives from each tribe contributing special woods, herbs, and sacred items to create a fire unlike any Martha had ever seen. The flames burned in brilliant colors as different materials were added: blue from copper-bearing wood, green from certain herbs, and brilliant white from purified salts that had been blessed in various tribal ceremonies. Martha sat in a place of honor beside the fire, wrapped in the beautiful blanket that had been her first gift, and wearing the turquoise necklace that connected her to generations of Native American grandmothers. As the ceremony progressed, she began to understand that she was not just receiving honors, but taking on sacred responsibilities that would last for the rest of her life. Each tribal elder spoke about the significance of hospitality in their respective cultures, sharing ancient stories that emphasized the spiritual importance of caring for strangers. These weren't just nice tales about being polite to visitors. They were fundamental teachings about the interconnectedness of all life and the sacred duty to nurture that connection through acts of kindness. Hopi Elder told the story of Spider Grandmother, who taught that every person you meet might be a holy being in disguise, and that treating everyone with respect and generosity ensures that you never accidentally turn away someone sacred. A Cherokee representative shared the legend of the Corn Mother, who showed that sharing food was a way of sharing life itself, creating bonds that could never be broken. As the stories continued, Martha realized that her simple act of making stew for hungry travelers had connected her to spiritual traditions that stretched back thousands of years. She wasn't just being thanked for kindness, she was being recognized as someone who had instinctively understood and acted upon some of the most fundamental principles of human civilization. When it came time for Martha to speak, she stood slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The fire crackled softly, and the desert night was filled with the kind of profound silence that only comes when people are truly listening with their hearts. 3 days ago, I was just a lonely old woman living by herself in the desert, Martha began, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I thought my useful days were behind me, that I didn't have much left to contribute to the world. But you've shown me that small acts of kindness can create miracles, she paused, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight, seeing grandparents, parents, and children who had all been touched in some way by her simple decision to share a meal. You've taught me that I'm not alone, that I have family I never knew existed, and that kindness doesn't have boundaries of race or culture or religion. You've given me a new understanding of what it means to be human, and I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to the honor you've given me. Her words were met with a profound silence, followed by what seemed like a spontaneous outpouring of appreciation from the entire gathering. People called out blessings in various languages, and the sound created a harmony that seemed to rise with the sparks from the sacred fire toward the star-filled sky. Thomas Begay stood and announced that the ceremony would conclude with a commitment that would bind all the participants together for generations to come. Each tribe would designate Martha's property as a place of peace and sanctuary, where any traveler from any background would always be welcome. From this night forward, Thomas declared, this place will be known among our peoples as Grandmother's House. It will be marked on our maps and remembered in our stories as a place where kindness lives and where all are welcome. The practical implications of this designation began to sink in as various tribal leaders explained what it would mean. Martha's property would be visited regularly by Native American families traveling through the area. She would be invited to participate in ceremonies and celebrations throughout the year. Most importantly, she would serve as a living symbol of the possibility for understanding and cooperation between different cultures. As the ceremony concluded and people began to prepare for their final night at the gathering, Martha felt a mixture of excitement and slight apprehension about her new role. Her quiet retirement had become something far more complex and meaningful, but she felt ready for the challenge. Over the next 2 days, as the various groups gradually departed, Martha received practical help in preparing for her new responsibilities. Families left her with emergency supplies, communication devices to stay in touch with different communities, and detailed information about tribal customs and protocols that would help her fulfill her role appropriately. Several young people volunteered to check on her regularly and help with maintenance of her property, which would now see much more activity than before. A group of women taught her how to prepare traditional foods so she could properly welcome Native American visitors, and elders shared stories and cultural information that would help her understand the significance of various ceremonies and customs. When the last families finally departed, Martha stood alone on her porch for the first time in nearly a week. Her property bore obvious signs of the extraordinary gathering: fire circles, worn paths, and small gifts that families had left as permanent markers of their visit. But the most significant change was in Martha herself. She was no longer just an elderly widow living in isolation. She had become grandmother who feeds the hungry, a bridge between cultures, and a living reminder that kindness could create miracles. In the months that followed, Martha's life became everything the tribal elders had promised. Her home became a regular stopping point for Native American travelers, a place where cultural exchange happened naturally, and where the simple act of sharing meals continued to build understanding between different peoples. She attended powwows, naming ceremonies, and seasonal celebrations, always welcomed as honored family. Her story spread beyond the Southwest, inspiring similar acts of kindness in communities across the country and demonstrating that individual actions could still make a profound difference in a complex world. Martha had discovered that retirement didn't have to mean retreat from life. but could instead mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter filled with purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to one's highest values. Her simple decision to feed 15 hungry strangers had transformed not only her own life but had created ripples of positive change that would continue for generations to come. The desert winds that had once whispered only of solitude now carried stories of connection, kindness, and the profound truth that family could be created anywhere that hearts were open and hands were willing to serve.